Welcome to our Fortune Brainstorm Tech event presented in partnership with Citi and Deloitte. I'm Michal Avram, Senior Writer with Fortune and Brainstorm Tech Co-Chair at Fortune. Thank you for being with us here today. Today, our discussion is going to focus on how technology is driving the energy transition, the new markets emerging to support sustainable economies, and how there has never been a better time for government and private collaboration on a range of policies that will hopefully accelerate us into a better future in many ways. While we're unable to get together in Las Vegas, which feels so far away for this conversation this year at our annual dinner, we are really excited to have you all join us here today to kick off CES Week virtually. We're grateful to have three insightful discussion leaders with us to help guide our conversation today, and I'm going to briefly introduce them. Emmanuel Lagarrigue is Chief Innovation Officer and member of the Executive Committee with Schneider Electric. Amos Hochstein is National Security and Energy Expert and a former Obama and Biden Special Envoy for International Energy. Nancy Pfund is founder and managing partner with DBL Partners. Thank you to the three of you for being with us today. And I promise I will stop talking soon, but before we start, a reminder that today's event is on the record. It's also interactive, so we want to hear from all of you. This is about exchanging ideas and sharing experiences. We want to hear your thoughts as well. Please put your questions or comments in the chat function at the bottom of the screen. I'm going to call on you later on in the second half to share your thoughts with the group, hopefully with your camera on. Please be sure to unmute, give us your name, and tell us where you're from. So let's get started. I know we are all still reeling from last week's events, but I really hope we can take this hour to engage in a forward-looking conversation on this very important topic. So I want to start by asking each of our panelists about their expectations from the incoming administration. We know what the last 4 years held when it came to the federal government's actions on climate. What do you expect or want to see from the incoming Biden-Harris administration on both regulation and investment as it pertains to sustainable technologies and energy in the near term? So Amos, I hope you don't mind. I'm going to start with you and put you on the spot. Give us your thoughts. You've got some experience here.
Well, thank you, Michal, and it's great to be here. And I too wish I could do this in Las Vegas. But it's great to be able to do this at least virtually. And this is probably the most timely conversation to have, just as we're about to have the inauguration of President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. But let me get to your question. I think the way this new team is coming into place and the thinking going from the transitioning from the campaign to the transition and now to putting the rhetoric of campaigns don't always match that of governing, but really putting together a team that is able to focus on taking the next step. So what are my expectations and we can discuss it further as we go along today, but at the high level, I think a few things. One is the symbolic gestures of rejoining the Paris Accords right away, placing climate at the very top of the national security agenda. And one of the things that was missing even in the Obama administration when we were successful in the Paris negotiations is that energy and climate were really not part of the main national security agenda. So that means that when national security discussions were being held with other countries around the world, outside of the push for the Paris Accords, it wasn't really part of that, didn't have that great seat at the national security table at the senior level. And that will be different here. We have that guarantee with the John Kerry apparatus, which straddles both the State Department and the White House, as well as having Gina McCarthy and a whole host of other people that are focusing on climate change and renewable energy. And I think what I expect to see where the most impact will be is in this cross between the shared space between the domestic policy and the international policy. So one is to try to recapture a role of the United States, no longer as the lead, but maybe together with others leading in a coalition around the world towards bigger goals and more ambitious agenda. But at the same time, really focusing in the domestic side of how do you translate this moment of COVID to hopefully post-COVID investment in. And this is where I think the most important part of it is. One is return on the regulatory path and putting the emphasis on getting some executive orders quickly, followed by legislation. Second is to see how do you use the power of the government, both purchasing government, not just regulatory, but purchasing power of the government and the financial power of the government to tip the scales, not to allow for a slow growth, but rather to create exponential growth by allowing more cheaper money and more financing towards R&D, newer technologies, and implementation and distribution of technologies, and the electrification process. These are big agenda items that I think that they're going to try to focus on, and we can talk a little bit later. There are a lot of challenges to that as well, but I think the biggest change that I expect is this really huge focus of an all-in-government approach to try to put these innovative ideas together of how do we put government money so that the private sector money can be leveraged and to allow these kinds of investments to occur at a much more exponential rate rather than just regular growth rate.
Thank you. I think that's a good segue to you, Nancy. So I'd love to hear your perspective. Same question. And you're muted. We're missing all the good stuff you're saying.
Okay, sorry about that. You can hear me now? Yeah. Well, so I was just saying we're off to a great start because in the omnibus bill already, we got the ITC, the wind tax credit, offshore included, extended. We got $35 billion for R&D for solar, wind, storage, geothermal, an area we're excited about, a newer area. So that kind of is the preview of things to come. And of course, we need the carrot and the stick. We need the carrot to encourage the right kind of energy adoption, but we also need the stick. We need to make the social and economic costs of fossil emissions hurt and make those investments less attractive. And so one of the things as an investor that we're very excited about is on the finance investment side is requiring public companies this move to detail their climate risk exposure, to look at their greenhouse gas emissions. Again, Europe and the UK are ahead of us on this, but we're going to catch up with the new administration. And that's super important because investors, once they see that there are these liabilities on balance sheets, they look for alternatives in terms of rebalancing their portfolios and making investments that don't have those. That was so true. We can talk about later in our investment in Tesla, 15 years ago. And then I think you'll see more creativity as these agencies, to what Amos said a few minutes ago, really incorporate climate in their core, even if that's not what you think of them as doing. And one example would be the USDA is talking about a carbon bank that would allow forest owners and farm owners to get paid for conserving, for creating less carbon in their land assets, which is a fantastic idea, this ability to create incentives to preserve forests and usher in a new era of low carbon agriculture, which is going to happen. And it's very exciting. We can talk about later. But anyway, I just think that carrot and stick and more creative approaches and really getting at the investment community and showing them really what they own so they can rebalance and get away from some of these very high risk fossil related investments.
Right, and I should mention that Nancy was on the boards of both Tesla and Solar City, so thank you for sharing that perspective. Emmanuel, I'm gonna go over to you. I'd love to hear from Schneider's perspective. What do you expect? What do you hope to see?
Well, hi everyone. I would agree with Amos that climate change will probably become a topic of national security, and I would even bet that the new administration will probably use this position and this returning to the Paris Accord as a lever to get closer to Europe, especially, And there are two topics that the new administration will play on. Of course, that renewal of democracy that we all crave for, and green. And this is what, as Nancy was saying, this is what Europeans want to hear. So that's very good opportunity for the US government to use this to come back as the kind of the leader of the free world, or the leader of the green world, I should say. And then the second thing is that the difference between now and clean tech 1.0 is that you have a positive business case in most businesses related to electrification, to decarbonization of energy. So very quickly and with very few incentives, we will see the economy firing up and jobs being created and wealth being created. During this year, there was a lot of creativity, a lot of new startups created in the energy space. And in this kind of almost post-war era where all the governments are going to engage in that race to green, I would see something very similar to what we experienced probably in the 60s, with fast economic growth fueled by one big topic, which will be the decarbonization of our economies. So very hopeful about what's going to happen, and definitely the US will probably lead that charge, as it was the case back in the 60s.
So Amos, I'm wondering if you could chime in on that. You used the word symbolic in our return to some of the international agreements, and I know you've talked about our flip-flops from administration to administration and losing some of the world's, our leadership position. Do you think that we can, as the United States, thinking of I'm using that as a viewpoint right now, even though we're having a global conversation, but do you think that there's an opportunity to regain a leadership role? And does it even matter? I mean, can corporations in partnership with the government now hopefully be the leaders going forward?
Well, what I mean when I say that is that we can't, as optimistic as we are about the fact that we have a new administration, and we really are, and I really believe in this team, you can't walk into 2021 expecting that we're just erasing the last 4 years and the United States is walking onto the international stage as though we are in 2016 and we're just snapping our fingers and let's play pretend. A lot has happened in the last 4 years. So I refer to it as symbolic, but not as a pejoratively. I mean that positively. Day one joining of Paris. And the reason it's symbolic is because it's setting this, making a statement that what was done in 2017, we are returning to the 2016 mindset of returning to the Paris Accords. However, we are coming into it with the intention of negotiating a new goals and more aggressive and more ambitious agenda than what was agreed to 4 or 5 years ago. So yes, it's symbolic that we're returning to Paris, but that's sort of the day one statement that the United States is shifting its focus. But it's a bigger issue, what you mentioned in your question that I've been writing about, as that is the world has also learned its lessons in how to deal with the United States. And we're still, when I was in the government working for Vice President Biden, you'd go in some places around the world and say, look, guys, you came to us in Kyoto. I mean, remarkably, people still telling me about, the scars of Kyoto, where the administration was pushing countries in a certain direction, but wasn't able to deliver back home the United States Senate to ratify the agreement and so on. So there is that legacy, combined with the fact that a lot of the work that was done in the second term of the Obama administration was done by executive order that was wiped out by the Trump administration, and a complete reversal of fortune. So the many in the globals, in other governments and companies around the world, are going to hold the U.S. team coming in a little bit more to the fire here of saying, okay, what are you actually going to be able to do? Now, a lot's changed since the Democrats are now going to be the majority in the Senate, and that clearly is a big change. But the skepticism that some have around the world of making sure that the U.S. cannot just promise and make big announcements and big NDCs, but can actually follow through, not only to implement in the US, but also to implement in such a way that there's some certainty that it will be lasting, using legislation more than executive order. And I caution some folks as saying, look, even though we're going to control, Democrats are going to have a majority in the House of Representatives, a very thin majority in the Senate, and the administration, and the Trump administration may be gone. But what won't be gone is the legacy, the judicial legacy that the Trump administration was able to achieve of putting in quite conservative judges that will still pose challenges for some of this regulatory process. I say all these as challenges that I think are overcomable, but when we walk onto that stage, we have to recognize that that Europe and other countries around the world are going to expect the US to come and deliver. So we can't just walk on 2021, say, we're back, everything, let's forget about the last 4 years and move forward. Having said all that, I do think from a leadership perspective, Michal, that the US doesn't need to be the leader. And I really liked, Emmanuel, your comment, not the leader of the free world, but the leader of the green world. Parts of the leaders of the green world definitely are not part of the free world. So I think that the world is in a different place than it was. The major achievement of the Obama administration was getting Prime Minister Modi and President Xi to join the Paris Accords. Today, that's not a major achievement anymore. The goals that China has placed are fairly aggressive. So I think we're in a different place, and we don't need to be the leader. We just need to bring the world together and push for this coalition. And I go back to what Nancy said before. The way we will get our seat back at the table with credibility is what we do at home. If we're able to partner with and incentivize the business community in the United States to grow these investments and to use, Nancy talked about a carrot and a stick. The stick part is going to be hard, although I think necessary. But I think the incentive, making this transition more acceptable and palatable to a broader swath of the American population is going to be critical to the success of the administration of being able to move this along and working together with the private sector to get there.
So Nancy, does that, whatever the level of skepticism is from the international community, from an investor's perspective, does that come into play for you, and is that detrimental? I mean, a venture capitalist is not looking at investments in 4-year blocks. You're looking 10 to 15 years out. So what impact does this have, if any, on the kind of investments that you're making today? And we'd love to hear about the kind of investments you're making today after you answer the first part of the question, please.
Okay, well, of course the government's role is critical, but one person's stick is another person's carrot. When Governor Newsom, says no more gas cars by 2035, that's bad for gas car manufacturers. It's great for electric vehicle manufacturers. And so these overarching policies that create that visibility for investors are super important. But it's not just the federal government. It's even local, bans of natural gas are creating signals for people like me to, okay, electrify. As Emmanuel said, we've got to electrify basically everything. And so the government is super important, and we work with all levels of government with our investment approach. But the markets have already spoken. You just had Elon Musk on your cover, and he's the richest man in the world. And Tesla is one of the most valuable companies in the world from relative obscurity 10 years ago. And so this flipping the switch to green happens a lot more quickly than you think. And part of it is because many people, including myself, invested 15 years ago in solar, in EVs, in batteries, and now those costs have come down so that there is a very solid economic case, as Emmanuel was saying. And so where does that point our investment strategy? Well, sort of short, medium, long term, certainly the more traditional sides of our business, the solar, the wind, the geothermal, the batteries, that's all going to be very, very robust. We are looking at the electrification of everything. And since this is the Consumer Electronics Show that we're all gathered around virtually, cars are electronic. people love their cars, and so we're looking at other areas that are natural gas dependent, but they could be switched, that people really care about. And just one example is coffee. Coffee is, 400 million cups a day are consumed. It's basically a cup of carbon. Sorry to make you feel guilty, but it's over a $200 billion industry, and we roast coffee with natural gas. And so there's a company called Bellwether Coffee here in Berkeley that is making sort of a solar city for roasting, a sleek electric, non-emissions electric roaster that has all the electronics programmed into it so that you can pick your favorite roast, you can tip your farmer, and you can get better coffee. And so we're going to see this electrification go into so many consumer and business areas. The developing world, I'm sure we'll talk about that. We really can help them skip the generation of fossil to a certain extent, as they did with cell phones a decade ago. And agriculture, in the medium term, you're going to see so much decarbonization of that sector, and that's 30% of global carbon. Is 30% of people work in food and ag, and we have a lot of mouths to feed over the next few decades. And so big data companies, one company called Farmers Business Network, are aggregating the data of what goes on a farm and working with federal regulators to create a carbon score. Because as a farmer, you can reduce your carbon by low-till, no-till, different kinds of practices. And if you got a score and all of a sudden, General Mills or Unilever said, I'll pay you more for that grain you grew with a low carbon score than with a high carbon score, all of a sudden the farmers are able to monetize carbon saving practices. And we will get to zero carbon or very low carbon agriculture over the next 10 to 20 years, which is, we have no choice. It's just like energy and automobiles. So those are some of the areas: conservation, resource optimization, the use of forests to again, change our 20th century business model, which was monetize the destruction of forests, to monetize the protection of forests. We've got some deals going there. And of course, something that's been overlooked in our grid is obviously, sitting here in California, the wildfire issue. We're fighting 21st century fires with 20th century technology. And there's so much we can do, from drones to AI to software, to level that playing field. So those are just a few of the areas that we're looking at.
Great. I now feel self-conscious about taking a sip from my coffee cup here. But
fix that for you.
Emmanuel, Schneider obviously has been around a little bit longer than Tesla and some of the other companies that Nancy mentioned. Can you take us through the journey at Schneider, and which investments in which technologies that you made a little bit earlier on are really helping to pave the way now?
Look, I think back to what Amos and Nancy were saying, I think there's one big difference between now and 2016 is precisely that technology and has continued to evolve, and market have spoken. We are very close to what we call vehicle parity, for instance. So that's the moment when the consumer steps into a dealership to buy a car, and he or she looks left and has the traditional mid-size car gas version, and it looks right. There's the same car, electric. The electric has more autonomy, it's more fun to drive, and it's cheaper. This is in 3-4 years from now, not farther away from this. So that day you start buying cars. So why? Well, basically technology and the fact that the OEMs will invest more and more in the electric versions and abandon this. So this is so batteries and battery technology is definitely one of the big game changers here, and we have invested in technologies that help lithium-ion batteries last longer, having a better view and better insight on the aging of those batteries. There's a company called Titan AES that was formed in Boston. There's a big cluster of battery technology and storage technology around MIT, actually. So this is one big game changer is battery technologies. and it's not all about volume and economies of scale, where China is, of course, dominating today in batteries. It's also about technologies and the AI you can put around this to have a better usage and a more efficient usage of batteries and their production. The other big thing is AI, software. This is the big game changer. So today, for instance, we're working with several utilities, especially in Australia, because for a number of reasons, Australia is probably 2 or 3 years ahead of the rest of the world in terms of the energy transition. And today, it's normal for an electric utility in Australia to think of itself in the future as a company that's just manages the grid, and is a big software company that keeps the lights on in a world where everybody is uploading and downloading electricity at any time of the day or the night. But definitely that utility in the future doesn't see itself as a power producer, as a power reseller. And we know that the new management at PG&E starts thinking like this, because the only way to solve the problem and to change this will be bringing the software technologies that enables that proliferation of decentralized energy resources, and so on and so forth. So, and here again, the US and especially the Bay Area has a very big role to play on the global scene when it comes to green, and the power of innovation of that part of the world will be very, very important, because software would be, together with batteries, the other big technology that will accelerate that transition to green.
Thank you, Emmanuel. You know, I'm just curious, following what Nancy and you said, Emmanuel, and talking about some of the wildfires. I'm here in California, in the Bay Area. But how many of you over the last, let's say, like 2-3 years have been personally impacted by climate, by some, you know, whether it's a hurricane or fire? I mean, and I'm talking about impacted either your business or your travel plans or your quality of life, or, you know, you name it, but show of hands.
I'm sitting right next to a very high-end air purifier. That's all gone.
I've got one in every room here. Okay, I want to bring in the rest of you to the conversation here. And Scott, we're going to start with you, Scott from Deloitte, if you wouldn't mind unmuting yourself and introducing yourself. And I believe you have some thoughts to share and perhaps a question.
Terrific, Mikhail. Thank you very much. It's nice to be with everyone. I want to add to the welcome for joining us this year. This is the 4th year that Fortune and Citi and ourselves have hosted this event. We, of course, wish that we were live in Las Vegas, I think, that we wish we were live, or at least had the possibility to be live. And but, you know, what we've done every year is it's been sort of an ongoing dialogue around technology, adoption, sort of implications for society. And it's been really around mobility. And this year, we decided, for a whole host of reasons, to sort of broaden the aperture to be around sustainability and climate change. On a personal note, that has also been driven by, I've spent the last 5 years founding and leading Deloitte's global future mobility practice, and was just recently named as the US leader for sustainability and climate change. And the focus of our work on FOM has really been to think about this as a massive system, and how do you bring these different pieces together to essentially form new ecosystems that could bring about this promise of sort of faster, safer, cleaner, cheaper, much more inclusive and accessible mobility. So when we intend, I don't know if you've seen, but back in September, Deloitte made an announcement around its ambitions around climate. We called it World Climate. We committed that we would operate with net zero emissions by 2030, that we would operate green, we would empower our people, and we would reach beyond our walls to catalyze progress with others. And so the focus as we move forward is to leverage a lot of what we've learned from mobility, but it's massively much more complex. We're talking about essentially most parts of our economy. And I think the setting of this conversation today actually leads to the question. We know that the transition to a low carbon future won't be easy. Like all major tectonic shifts, there are trade-offs, transition costs, and needed investments. There is a reasonable likelihood that climate change will disproportionately impact those with the fewest means to adapt and who have done the least to emit planet warming gases. We know that well-established economic systems that account for large portions of global GDP, employ millions of people, and fund government budgets are going to be challenged. Nancy, you hit upon this exactly. What's good for the electric automotive manufacturers is not good for the gas and diesel internal combustion engine automotive manufacturers. And so, ideally, we would like to not sacrifice economic growth for equitable prosperity and ecological stewardship. The focus, I think, is shifting not from the need, but really to how. How do we actually accelerate the adoption of these new technologies, sustainable operating practices, and business model innovation? So the question I have is, given the really tight window we have to cut our greenhouse gases by 50% by 2030 and net zero by 2050, how do we thread the needle of business, labor, government in terms of policy, regulation, investment, innovation, community leaders, so that we actually get this right? We don't have a lot of room for error. We kind of know what needs to be done. So how are we going to orchestrate this massive set of players to actually make this happen? It's a really big question, but it sort of, I think, builds on a lot of what we've talked about.
Amos, do you want to take a first crack at that?
Yeah, and Scott, first of all, congratulations on both the role that you played at Deloitte and the tremendous achievement to be able to get Deloitte to make that kind of a commitment. Look, I think you're touching at the very end of your question on, I think it's very different when you sit at the Bay Area or if you sit in certain different parts of the United States, and you get a very different, I'm in Washington, Nancy's in California, but then you go to other parts of specifically the non-coasts, you have a very different picture of the country. And I think the biggest challenge that, and Scott, I know your question is a global one. I'll answer it as first addressing the US and then broadening it to the globe. We have a complicated coalition that has to come together. And it's both represented in the United States and as well overseas. And that is, you talked about justice, climate justice, equity, and this is a challenge for the Biden team coming in. They held this coalition together really fragilely during the campaign, but the division lines are there. And when one side says, look, we're going to create a lot more jobs in the green tech economy and so on, it's not geographically in the same necessarily places that the jobs will come from. So Nancy, I thought, put it perfectly that one person's stick is somebody else's carrot. I think that's exactly right. But when you look at it from a public policy perspective, that creates some challenges of, I'm going to have haves and have-nots, and the timing of it is not perfect, right? So I'm going to have a period of time when some people will be out of a job, and as it transitions elsewhere. In the long run, I think this will fix itself, because this will create a lot more jobs than it will displace. But that period of time of displacement is very concerning to the people who have those jobs at the moment in different parts of the United States. It is also a racial issue, and where we have lower income and different communities who will not benefit immediately from the transition, and the public policy will have to be around, how do you manage this transition so that it is not seen as unequitable, and that's going to be the role of government, while the role of the private sector is to accelerate the investments into these things so that we can have this faster. But that's going to be that role of government. That's not the investor issue. That's a government issue of how to do that. But translate that now into the global scene, where China can do things by edict and it has a lot of money and so on. But where are we in Indonesia and in India and Southeast Asia and some parts of Central America, where we can talk about skipping generations of technology as we did with the cell phones, but it's not apples to apples here. There are challenges in that. And when when the goal is to electrify things in countries where the grids are weak, they don't reach where they need to reach, and there's a lot of other systemic challenges to doing that. These become real challenges. And that's why I talked earlier about putting this into the global foreign policy, national security cooperation, so that this doesn't become a China, Europe, US axis of energy transition, but rather that these blocks of countries are also investing at the very same time in the transition in other countries around the world that can't afford it. And what they couldn't afford 2 years ago, they can afford less now. Many of these countries, as a result of COVID, have lost even more of their sovereign wealth. And so the ability to put money towards infrastructure is going to have to be supplemented by international banks, by international financial organizations, and as well institutions, as well as governments around the world. So that's that justice piece and equity piece, Scott, that you talked about. I think that's the role that the US government, together with other governments around the world, are going to have to come to Nancy and say, and the like, and say, okay, how do we solve this? How do I do it? Not only solve it in the US, but how do I solve it in countries that can't afford it? What do I do? And I'll tell you from my experience in the Obama administration, the Power Africa was supposed to do that and did not. We had a lot of challenges, and we've been learning lessons from that. So I think that's where the private sector and the government sector is going to have to come together to figure that piece of it out.
Well, and I would just say that we're already doing that. We need to do more. But for example, in Africa, we have a company called Zola, which has worked with Enphase, a huge stock in the energy space, an inverter company, to create a solar and storage battery system that's inexpensive, that allows not just people in the rural parts of Africa to have electricity in the first place, which many of them don't, but really gets at this pernicious issue of urban growth in places in the continent of Africa, like a city like Lagos, where the grid goes down every day and people buy diesel generators and put them in their buildings so that their air conditioning stays on, or whatever it is. That's like your worst nightmare of a climate solution, a health solution, and it's a terrible thing, the noise, having to turn it on and off. So getting rid of that is already beginning to happen. And Zola, working with US-based technology and working with African investors and companies we may not skip the entire generation, but it's doable, and it's not more expensive, and the cost, of course, will come down. So we need to get government to kind of realize that we can do this. We just need to unlock some of the barriers that exist from having done things the same way for many years. And then back to our country, in terms of the environmental justice issues, there's no question that we need to address these much more successfully. I think that our industry, compared to the tech industry, is more diverse. That's a pretty low bar, because as impact investors, we track the gender and the ethnicity of our company employees, and we have a ways to go, but there are some surprises. And for one thing, there are over 3 million Americans working in the clean energy sector. The Midwest, which is always like coal country or steel country, that's the fastest growing segment for clean tech jobs. So it isn't as dire as everyone says. And in terms of ranking of fastest growing jobs left in 2020, it was wind turbine technicians and solar installers, which are not going to be exported. And those wages are usually, we have found, 25% higher and come with better benefits than traditional extractive kinds of jobs. So we have some of the raw material. We've just done a terrible job of measuring it and managing to it, and then just linking out to the various stakeholders to get better at it. And then just the last thing I would say is, guilty as charged. Have worked in the Bay Area for my entire career. But one of the things I'm most excited about is when I go to Omaha or to South Dakota, working with some of our ag companies, including Farmers Business Network that I mentioned earlier, it's the younger farmers. There's a generational change happening here. They want it. By definition, farmers pass their land on to generation after generation, and they want it to be healthy. And so now this, the new farmers are aware that they need to do things differently. They need to get rid of the middleman and use and work with suppliers that can give them better pricing, better seeds, less of an oligopoly and more of a competitive pricing network. And we can do that now thanks to big data from the coast, merging with the growing ethic and necessity for farmers to farm in a way that is consistent with 21st century needs. And so we're really excited about what can happen when those worlds come together from a business point of view, from a social point of view. It can get, help to solve these divisions that we're experiencing in our country that are tearing us apart. So we're cautiously optimistic.
The other perspective I would offer here is this energy transition, like all the other energy transitions we have gone through as a civilization, will be demand driven, not supply, right? So sometimes we make the mistake of thinking that, or trying to reproduce and replicate that big supply chain that we have for oil or for electricity today into renewables, right? So, of course, replacing fossil fuel power plants by solar panels and windmills helps. That contributes, but that's not the transition. That's not. There's a more fundamental change in business model that is to operate. So that would be demand driven. That would be businesses, and we see that today at Schneider Electric in businesses in the Bay Area, which come to us and tell us, you know what, I think I'm done with my utility because I'm paying too much for my electricity. I have resiliency issues. And I've just signed that pledge in front of my shareholders and my customers that I would decarbonize. I'm still receiving energy made out of fossil fuel. I'm done. I want my own energy. I want it resilient. I want it sustainable, and I want it cheaper. So it's demand driven. Same for the adoption of electric vehicle, the adoption of solar panels and power walls in homes. So that's going to be demand driven and just pulled by the market as the technologies become cheaper and the frictions to install those technologies are reduced. So demand driven, and of course that demand, like everything in the history of the technology adoption in the US, will start on the coast, and we see that today. But eventually will come over the rest of the country. So, and there will be a lot of jobs created around this, not only in tech, but also in installation. You have to install all those charging stations and those solar panels and those power walls that will come with the electrification of energy. So that's demand driven, not supply driven, like any other of at least the last 3 energy transitions we went through. The other thing on the location of jobs, of course, there will be jobs destroyed and a lot of jobs created. But if you think about it, take the example of EV manufacturing. So most cars will be electric, and the cars manufactured in the US will be electric cars. A very important component of those cars is the battery. There is no way we are going to import those batteries from China. And there's no way we can do that with just 1 or 2 gigafactories. So we see that already in Europe, where today the estimate is that just Western Europe will need between 30 to 50 gigafactories just to supply the auto OEMs. So the same will happen in the US. And where are those gigafactories going to be built? Probably in the south, very close to the car manufacturing plants. A gigafactory is roughly $2.5 to $3 billion investment, 3,000 jobs. So this is where we can match this energy transition with employment and really create green jobs.
Thank you, Scott. That was a very weighty and wonderful question. I'm sure we just scratched the surface there, but thank you. Leon, I know you had some thoughts to share as well, so I want to go to you. Thank you, by the way, for being the one person who always pronounces my name correctly. But please introduce yourself and go ahead and share with us what you'd like to say. You're muted.
My pleasure, Michal. And can you hear me now? You can hear me now. Okay, great. Thank you. I'm Leon Calvari. I'm chairman of Citi's Institutional Clients Group, and I'm honored to be part of this discussion with certainly people much more qualified than I am. And congratulations to my friend and partner, Scott. A couple of things. Obviously, from a Citi standpoint, we have made significant commitments in terms of sustainable finance, in terms of avoiding financing areas that could be deemed to be environmentally unsafe. And that ties into our overall program in terms of ESG, in terms of racial equality vis-a-vis the hiring, in terms of our pay structure, et cetera. But there are many, many issues that you raised, and certainly Amos, Nancy, Emmanuel, that was profound. I guess I come at it from a similar vantage point, and I'm going to come on to where Emmanuel ended off in terms of demand. A couple of thoughts from my side, and that is, I feel to a certain extent that some of the issues that we are discussing today have become highly politicized, especially from a US standpoint. Certain people hear about the Green New Deal and they roll their eyes. They couldn't actually explain to you what it is, but they roll their eyes. So there's a visceral reaction against it. And part of it becomes, I think, as we deal, and I was fascinated, Nancy, to hear about your discussions about your travel, certain places I've been to, like Omaha. But I do think at the end of the day here, that this is a demand-driven issue, and I put a lot more faith, personally, taking my Citi hat off, on private enterprise, because I think private enterprise here has become critical. Obviously, we've all watched, Nancy, probably through your stewardship at the board, the explosion of Tesla's market cap. On the other hand, it's interesting to see what Tesla will end up doing back in terms of the environment, in terms of building out the grid and things like that are needed here. Because with an $800 billion market cap, obviously the country right now is significantly underbuilt in terms of an electrical charging grid. And the other side, and I'm going to be interested in people's view about this, is to what extent this, from a demand-driven standpoint, can be created such that it is part of people's everyday life, as opposed to certain people, and I travel a lot, even during these times have been, where people look at this as something that is potentially an elite problem that is being focused on the coast. And I'm just giving an American discussion right now, and I'm not claiming to be right. The comfort that I get comes from a completely different place. And that is when you go into Walmart and Costco and you talk to the CEOs, et cetera, they will tell you that their fastest growing areas are organic food, something people would have not really discussed years from now. So as I look at it here, I think, Nancy, especially when you look at it from a market standpoint, we've seen the interest from the so-called SPAC market in terms of battery technology, electrification technology, where it's all exploded. We've seen the obvious issues vis-a-vis Tesla. We also have a slightly contrary issue, which is, given what has happened in Saudi Arabia and given how big an investor they are in technology, will their capital be accepted? As people think forward here, I'd be interested in people's view, because obviously MBS wanted to significantly diversify the Saudi economy, looking ahead as to where a carbon-led economy was going to end up leading his country. So my main question becomes is, how do we ensure from a demand-driven standpoint that this becomes something that is part of people's everyday life, recognizing there may be a generational shift, but such that when people go to the auto dealer, they may not be buying a Tesla, it may be too fancy for them, but they will be demanding electrification. How do we ensure that when this occurs, that they are comfortable vis-a-vis the electrical grid that they're having to deal with? How do we ensure that as you travel in these areas of the country, and our interstate system is certainly something we can be proud of, that people can feel comfortable that this can be part of their everyday life? Because to me, if we can solve the demand-related issues from the consumer, broadly speaking, this will push companies. Because on the other hand, and then I'll close, the companies all want to get there. You look at the investments being done by the OEM in terms of electrification. You look at the commitments being made by the big food companies in terms of carbon-related issues, food production. The corporate will is there. The capital markets have demonstrated that investments in these areas will get a very low cost of capital, i.e. they're attractive investments. How do we ensure that, in this massive country that's going through a pandemic where people are much more focused on getting a vaccine than these issues, that this becomes front and foremost here right now, as opposed to be honest, a political football where, people don't actually want to read about it. They just have visceral reaction. So I'd love people's view on that. And again, thank you, Michal and Fortune and Alan for hosting this.
Thank you, Leon. Nancy, why don't we go to you for an answer on that? And I want to also, if we have time, very quickly bring in one or two of our audience members here to answer that same question. So go ahead, Nancy.
Well, I would say, sort of in our experience, companies like Tesla and SolarCity many years ago put mission on the map. Of course, they had technical expertise, they had fantastic go-to-market strategies, manufacturing chops, but they really were some of the pioneers in tapping into the growing desire on the part of the consumer, the demand, to address climate change with their wallets, not just at the ballot box. And this helped them grow. It helped them, importantly, hire the best and the brightest that want to do this, and develop political capital to undo some of the 20th century barriers that have been set up. And so, while of course these products are going to be more expensive in their early days, they get cheaper. They quickly come down in price, become more accessible. And what they do is, and it's why I mentioned coffee and agriculture and the organic food that you mentioned is a good example. People are passionate about their cars, they're passionate about their coffee, their food. And these are the teachable moments that broaden the base of demand for low carbon products. Because if you can not have that no sacrifice, we call it that no sacrifice approach, you can drive a fast car and not torch the planet. You can grow grain and have your cornflakes and have them be low carbon and pay the farmer more for that. You can same with coffee. You can do all of this, and these are the companies that especially as we encounter generational change with millennials and next Gen Z, it's not an option. I mean, people are buying these stocks, they're buying these products, they're going to work for these companies. The next gen will demand it. There is no turning back. And so putting yourself into that no sacrifice, good for the planet, good for what you need, and for social justice issues. This is really, this is why firms like ours are able to attract, large investors, and shout out to Citi for being one of our earliest investors when we first got started. This is where we're heading, and all of the impact investing and the ESG. The reason those fields are growing is because technology is married with social impact and creating something that has not existed before and that people can't get enough of. So that would be my suggestion for folks.
Right. Sam, I want to, and I'll get back to Emmanuel and Amos. I want you guys to have some final words as well, but we are starting to run out of time here. So Sam Aarons from Lyft, I'd love to hear your perspective on this same question. I mean, address the demand side, what you're seeing from younger customers, and then just very quickly give us a sense for what Lyft has sort of set as its goals and why. If you could introduce yourself real quick and take just 30 seconds to a minute to answer all of that, that would be awesome. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thanks, Michal, and thanks, Fortune, for organizing this. I'm Sam Aarons, the Director of Sustainability at Lyft. We also have Raj Kapoor, our Chief Strategy Officer, on the call here as well. I think on the demand side, that is something very strong that we're seeing, that the upcoming generation wants more and more to use products and to do things in a responsible way. And so we see a great opportunity for our business to capture that. And that's why we're the first ride-sharing company to adopt a goal of 100% electric vehicles by 2030 back over the past summer. Of course, it's not just cars. Many ships can and should be done in modes of transportation that are not cars. And that's why we also have, of course, our bike and scooter program, which I think had over 30 million rides this year, growing at leaps and bounds during this pandemic situation because people are wanting to have other ways to get around. So we really do see this as a good business opportunity, not only because of the demand side, but also because quite frankly, it will save money for drivers who adopt EV technology because the operation of those vehicles is actually cheaper than gasoline vehicles. I think now you're on mute.
This time I was muted. Sorry about that. I didn't say anything brilliant, don't worry. So I want to go back for some parting words here from our panelists. And I'm sorry I did not have more time to bring in more of you to the conversation I was hoping to, but of course, things always heat up the second half hour. So Emmanuel, Amos, you don't have to answer this same question. I'm hoping we can kind of end on hints of optimism. So if you'd like to take it elsewhere with your parting words, please do. But Emmanuel, let's go to you first.
Yes, thank you, Michal. Definitely, I'm very optimistic because, I mean, it's a combination of, we won't have to choose between the carrot and the stick because the financial institutions, as Leon was saying, are going to put a lot of emphasis on ESG. So if your business is not sustainable, if you're not delivering sustainability, your cost of capital is going to be higher. So that will naturally drive shareholders and boards and C-suites in the right direction. It's going to be demand driven, as Sam was saying, in all aspects. And again, demand driven by businesses and by consumers, and businesses will take a very logical approach, right? So I want something that's more efficient and that's better for my numbers and my P&L. I want something that's resilient because we have learned the price of resiliency in that pandemic last year. And I want something that's more sustainable because if I don't decarbonize my operations precisely, my cost of capital will be too high. My shareholders will not like this. So I see that kind of virtuous circle where we have the alignment between capital providers, technologies which become affordable, and now alignment across the world, at least in Europe, China, and now the US, when it comes to decarbonization policies. So at least roadblocks will be removed. We don't need this time governments to push too much because market forces would probably make most of the job in this demand-driven transition.
Almost 30 seconds of final words for you.
Yeah, I think that as Leon, Emmanuel, Nancy, Sam, others had said, I'm full of optimism because I do believe that the hardest growth is at the early years. Now we have scale, we have the wind in our sails. I think the world is focused on this. I do believe we're gonna hit the targets that we need to. I just think that we need to focus on making sure that we do it across the board, across different societies, so that everybody grows at the same time. We have a time crunch both on emissions and reaching the 2 degrees, but we also want to prevent countries such as what is happening in Southeast Asia and South Asia, where there's billions of dollars of new investment in fossil fuel infrastructure. And we want that to stop in order to be able to accelerate, not just in the United States, but not to create new stranded assets long term. So we have a time crunch and we all have to come together to be able to figure out how to do this in the broadest way possible across the globe and across the country.
We have a time crunch here as well. Nancy, did you want to share anything else, or?
Just quickly, I mean, there's something for everyone. I mean, we geek out on solar and wind and batteries, but if you're into coffee, if you're into organic food, if you're into, even space we haven't even talked about, that's a huge area. There's something for everyone, and our ability to prosper is inextricably tied to the next generation's demand for careers with meaning and investments with impact. And I think that's such a powerful equation.
You're not also an investor in SpaceX, are you? Just to complete the trifecta.
Well, yeah, that's a whole nother subject. that I would love to talk about, but next time.
Next time, for sure. Well, this has been such a great dialogue. I wish we had more time, as always, but I want to thank our panelists, Nancy, Amos, and Emmanuel, for helping us to lead the conversation today. It really was fantastic. We'd also like to thank Citi and Deloitte for its partnership in hosting this gathering. And very importantly, thank you to all of you who attended and participated. We're going to continue these vital conversations in 2021, so please keep an eye on your email for information on upcoming Fortune events. Thank you again. I hope you all have a wonderful week, and we will see you soon.